This is the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency, presenting via intravenous drip a cacophony of consonants, a menage of morbidity, a quartet of the quaint. Why, I've got a whole sack of stories that'll leave ink in your ears. I am, of course, referring to that most moistened of presses, the Bone Zone Halloween Half Hour. Thank you. Tonight, in a ritual not unlike a delicate baby birding, I offer you 4 partially digested, full-colour tales of increasingly suspicious consequence. The first of which I doth name, the BUSMAN'S HOLIDAY. You are a bartender. Today is a Thursday, which you usually have off, but you are still going into work. You don't remember why, exactly. Maybe in the morning, when you woke, you felt like a drink, but now, you're just making your way from A to B, like you'll be coming home at 6 a.m. tired, exhausted, but sober. Any and all desire to have fun seems to have left you vacant and hollow, as you would find yourself on any other workday. It is as though you are called by some higher power as you pass your way through the ticket barriers, scanning your plastic top-up card against the RFID encasement. Time skips, or you black out momentarily because the turnstile takes you direct onto the train carriage, and you find yourself in a seat without meaning to do so. It's only an 8-minute journey to... Of course. That's right. It's only an 8-minute journey. More often than not, you feel guilty taking up a seat, but today you couldn't stand for 8 minutes even if you wanted to. Maybe, you think, you should just ride the full circuit of the city and loop back round to wherever it was that you got on, but surely more than 8 minutes have passed, have they not? Your eyes, heavier than floodlogged sandbags, fall limp, only for you to catch them moments later. Minutes go by, maybe an hour. That infernal tootling. What was it? Oh. It can only be your alarm clock. You are dreaming. And you are dreaming of the worst thing one can dream of, their own everyday life. A journey to work, how quaint. It wouldn't be unusual for you to wake and find you needed to be in work in half an hour, would it? But with the confidence of one standing at a long-awaited toilet and knowingly pissing the bed, you settle into the hard cushion of the fold-down public commute bench, stick your head against the shuddering plastic window, and accept the disciplinary awaiting in the morning. But something's not quite right, is it? Now you can't move your eyes, you can't move your head, or your arms, or your neck, like sleep paralysis, but you've never felt anything like this before, because trying to move is an option, and it feels like you will come apart at the seams if you tug any harder. You feel as though you'd only just gone to work. You still feel as tired as you did when you left work last night. When you left work last night, and you got on the train. There was some kind of accident, maybe a collision from the way the carriage shot straight up. It tossed in the air, you remember. You ended up upside down, but in the replay you witness it all from a seated position. It's like the very skin of your body has become one with the dirty carpet texture of the bench. You are hung painfully in the air as if you are velcroed or superglued. You know from the sheer agony that you could wriggle free, but at what cost? Only some of you is left now. As you strain your pus-yellow bleeding eyes, the grey-red wreckage of this tube train becomes the grey-red wreckage of another passenger, near deceased but not quite there yet. Amongst him is flesh that cannot belong to his core, canvassed across the concrete of a hose-clean operating room. His mouth whimpers, though his eyes look off in different directions. You are doing the same thing. You are all doing the same thing, and you are all still breathing, though not well. Is this how you will be kept alive? You cannot wonder. You cannot do anything but hurt. You have been kept upright, with thin hooks suspended from the ceiling, so ever-presently painful that even your own morphine-induced dream world could not deny their gravity. The voice from your dream, unreversed. It tells of your flesh, the back of which has been stripped away. It tells of your ribcage, much of which has been removed entirely to allow your lungs to be pumped like fireplace bellows with or without permission. You no longer have limbs or extremities of any kind, though that is no fault of the surgeons, but of the engineer bought off by one man's lecherous desire to express artistic license in the face of mankind's flawed design. A living wall of flesh, 360 breathing degrees of mortal coil, an amalgamation to make Frankenstein blush. 165 waking hours of work, 8 living, 14 dead for this abomination of glued blood vessels and butcher's twine, an exhibition in of itself. Imagine to be surrounded by that which makes you, you. They could not guarantee him a finishing time, so he stands still amongst their incessant workings out and lets his work soothe his own aching eyes. You can only hope that your alarm goes off too. Hang in there, sunshine. It'll all be over soon. To follow, drag your lethargy across this report from Tonopah, Arizona, circa 2023, where, unbeknownst to all but himself, Peter Peeper is about to ingest the better half of an entire atom bomb right into his irises. Help yourself to a slice of triple X-ray vision. Peter Peeper would be duped no more by advertisements in the back of his comic books or Ludi mags. He'd amassed a collection of 53 broken promises. Pointlessly, they took up space in his work desk, conveniently located in the maintenance hub of the local nuclear reactor. Some of them were just plastic poker shades. Some others had actual UV protection, which was a bonus, but it wasn't what Peter Peeper was looking for, was it? Peter wanted X-ray vision. The classic stuff, and by God, he was going to get it if it was the last thing he did. On the following Sunday, a day on which the power plant was seemingly left unguarded due to cutbacks, Peter Peeper strolled with gusto into his work with a grand smile on his face. He tipped his hat to the unmanned security cameras, he whistled as he walked, and carried with him a creation so unsurreptitious that it might have caused the Navy to intervene by its shape alone, were they about. It was made mostly from toilet paper tubing, taped together to form an oversized set of children's play binoculars, over which he'd haphazardly applied sporadic linings of tin foil to keep in the nuke juice. For balance, a combination of PVC and copper piping held it all together from the bottom. Then, when he arrived at the core, he let himself in and hastily applied most of a ventilation suit to keep his soon-to-be obliterated body fairly okay. He didn't much expect to make it out of this alive. Peter Peeper wasn't fooling anybody. He just thought it might work. And wasn't that worth something? He'd then have to start up the scary bit, intentionally overheating the operations center, purposefully causing a meltdown, and then wait in position for the room to automatically, hermetically seal for the safety of all those around it. Now, it was time for his creation to shine. At one end of this lengthy contraption, Peter had welded 2 self-made iron funnels to help channel the necessary radiation to where he needed it. At the other end of the tubes, Peter had put 2 rubber seal ports where he could comfortably place his bulging eyeballs. He'd zip his suit up around it and hope for the goddamn best. Painful, blinding, searing. These were not the simple thoughts going through Peter Peeper's head. No, there were no thoughts going through Peter's head. There was no room, not with all the radiation going through it. Oh, but I can assure you, it was all of those things and more. A torment of cosmic proportions, metaphysically impossible to describe, though Peter finds through trial and error every negative to suit the situation perfectly. And yet, old Peter Peeper must have been hoping real fucking hard, because after the aftershocks stopped and all the dust settled, he was still standing amongst the miles and miles of new nothing, From my perspective, it can only be assumed that Peter had been under the watch of a very empathetic god, who, rather than punishing him as expected, rewarded the poor lunatic for accomplishing the single most impossible thing a mortal had ever done. There was no reactor, not anymore, not in the perfect circle of ash and coal, and with that, there was no evidence of what he'd done to achieve this wildly imperceptible goal. And he had achieved it, for in his head, Peter Peeper no longer had eyeballs, but loose green sacs of oozing fluid which sweat and stank and slipped out from their sockets. Panic had no right to strike, not when madness had claimed this land. He grasped them in new blindness, scooped the non-Newtonian fluid of his face off the floor and slipped it right back into the cavity. Lo and behold, he could see. As long as the sacks were in his sockets, Peter could peep at everything around him. That said, it was all in green, but he could see for miles now if he wanted to. Before, he'd need his glasses to see the subtitles on the telly, and now... No, that was not the point of the experiment. Peter needed to know. He needed to. He'd done it. By God, he'd done it. He could see them, his bones, a bit blurred to his green gape. The skin was still there, just sort of transparent. It was done though. Bone. Bone. He laughed, and he watched, and he derived a strange sort of pleasure from the stinging sensation that his gaze cast upon his own invisible flesh. They'd heard the explosion miles away. It was a wonder that the surrounding areas weren't leveled in the blast. That was all the emergency crews could tell him, all they wanted to talk about. Nobody wanted to bring up what had happened to his eyes. They'd not come for him, they'd come to see what was left, and they'd come in full protective gear. It didn't hold a candle to Peter's new power. He could see right through their armor, through their clothes, right to their bones. He'd not gotten what he wanted, had he? For the rest of his life now, Peter would be haunted by the skeletal visage of the ever-impending mortal death, despite its initial glorious defeat. And well, the emergency services were safe because they'd wrapped up for the occasion, but the catastrophic rays cast from his eyes were more powerful than he could have imagined. It was a monkey's paw wish, if he knew the expression. Peter Peeper wasn't a good man. He'd chosen that name for one thing. He wanted X-ray vision because he wanted to occasionally look through the wall of the ladies' soccer team locker room and see through clothes and stuff, or maybe commit competition fraud by seeing where the golden ticket is hidden. He wanted comic book mischief when he got down to it, and instead, in his mind, he was cursed to never again lay eyes on flesh, and to only cause death when he tried. Still, in order to survive the fallout of this ordeal, he had to play the hero he'd always seen on TV. He was poked and prodded first, until he could convince them that he was fit to walk the streets of the Grand Canyon State once more as one of Mother Nature's marvels. X-Ray Man! Peter Peeper would turn his sight towards good. He donned a costume, approved by the FTC and everything, and he acted in the best interest of modern humanity, with those nuclear, globular masses bubbling in the cauldron of his skull, kept secure with the addition of tight swimming goggles. Our hero, wild as his story has been, began to settle down soon after his debut. Mostly, he was hired privately to sit somewhere hidden, like a sentient CCTV camera. He earned a stellar reputation, and even lowered the crime rate of his beloved home state. Internally, Peter was beginning to accept his fate. This was a good thing, he came to see. He'd done the right thing, eviscerating all those people. If this is what it came to, he was making a difference. Hell, he was the world's first superhero now. He was doing all right by their already forgotten names. So he forgave himself as he moved onwards with his life as X-Ray Man. But the desires that caused his condition, they never went away. They just changed. Flesh. Flesh was hidden from Peter Peeper, but the bone, the rarest of sights, the true voyeurism, it was so prevalent, it was everywhere, and nobody knew it. It was enough to drive you mad, or at least enough to rile up what's there. Eventually, he started to see them as beautiful, each unique, just like the skin bag wrapped around it. Only, You couldn't maintain your skeleton. You can't hide its imperfections. That which makes you, you. Not long after that, he felt the need to collect them. He just wanted to look at them without the Gaussian blur that obscured his otherwise perfect vision, but trips to the museum made him uncomfortable and gave the clerks aggressive cancer. He couldn't just take them. For bone, though it presents itself willingly, it is still sheathed in that aforementioned skin bag. It was that realization, that sudden understanding that he wanted something that he couldn't have, that set something off in his mind. It haunted his days at first, but then he came to relish in it at night when he could touch the bone, feel it. He broke. He would wait no more, for he knew what he had to do. He'd created the world's first superhero, and now he needed a rival. For the greater good, to satiate his grumbling desires, Peter Peeper set out into the night time. He donned his cape, slapped his weird little green goobers into his eye sockets, and set out for villainry. With his crafty slingshot, approved by the FTC for sale, he took out the street lamps as he passed to cover his hideous actions, directed into the darkness by the honk of a police radio. Peter sought out active crimes at first. He solved them by displaying his haunting green goobers to shock and stun, and then hacking apart the perpetrator with a miniature hatchet. He stole limbs first because he didn't think he'd want the whole thing. Well, limbs and tongues. Fear didn't seem enough motivation for silence, but that did it quite well for the most part. Eventually, he did want the rest. He got very confident very quickly. After all, who would stop him but himself? And even then, X-Ray Man didn't catch killers. His collection just grew and grew until he was damn near making his way through the whole city. Heads, shoulders, knees, and toes, and everything in between. Thousands from hundreds. He was going to build the biggest man, he told them. And he'll have 5,000 bones. And he'll be beautiful.
Now that was fucked up. Am I right, gang? I'd like to see the BBC Light programme try something as radical as this skullduggery. Get back, I say. I have nothing else for you. You, though, dear listener, if you've not had enough, I welcome you to partake in 2 to 3 inhales of this raw material I've entitled Sardines. Once upon a time, you were consciously afraid of ghosts. And who isn't, for a brief period? Was it an overdose of filmic fiction that started it all? Or did the fear simply exist as some kind of cosmically influenced, come-out-of-nowhere reminder that you will die one day? But like most reasonable young adults, you grew out of it eventually. Likely, you came to one of many realizations that there simply is no afterlife, or you simply decided otherwise and made it so. You remember your grandfather, who willingly answered your supernatural hypotheticals, even in his hospital bed. How, before he died, he told you that, put simply, you'd know if there were ghosts. There would be so many of them, wouldn't there? Everybody would have seen a ghost. He'd certainly have seen a ghost. He went through 2 wars, for crying out loud. Do you understand how many people have died, ever, where you're standing right now even? Ghost hunting would be a very lucrative business. You'd be overwhelmed by the sheer opportunity. That's what he told you. And then he died and joined their imaginary legions, and the concept slipped from your mind, for better or for worse. Now, after a long life lived well, or otherwise, you're set to join him. Join your folks, join your friends, join your god, maybe. You'd thought about it over time, but maybe you never came to a concrete decision. Maybe you left it too long. And now, you have hanging questions and nagging thoughts on eternity. You hope, as maybe we all do, on some level, for an afterlife. A heaven, a hell, any sort of continued existence, even damnation, is preferable to nullification, to the pervading negative space which stretches out before you as the last gasp of pure, tasteless, recycled, hospital-grade oxygen helps the brain relax into that lasting rest. It is a slow process as you go. Rest is an apt description. As you fall under the influence of chemical comfort, you are flooded with one final paradoxical thought. a moment of sheer human anarchy in the face of the great unknown, that you will wake, having slept better than you ever have before. Then, when your ticker clock's over and the engine slows to a stop, it hurts. It does, it really hurts. You feel your heart stopping in your chest, but you are unable to move or kick it back into gear. You drown in your own inability to catch your breath, and you don't want to go, you don't want to go. When you do wake, it is an astonishing surprise. You wake in the same place that you passed, though it is momentarily unfamiliar to you, for beforehand, it was a quiet, near-empty ward where your worried partner kept you quite comfortable under the assumption that you would not pass away just yet. And now, there is no such patronage. They have all already wept. They have already moved on. They've forgotten your voice, your cadence, the way you hung your head, the littlest things that make you, you. Soon, the rest will follow. They are long gone from this awful place, as are all of the living. Now you are surrounded. Every unliving thing is trapped. Not soulbound, not haunting, not damnation, but physically trapped like sardines. Your grandfather, God, did he know? No. If he had known how it would be, he would not have laughed as he told those stories. Every mortal man, every former child, every doctor, every patient, every insect, every living creature leaves something of themselves behind, intangible and rendered unseen to the naked eye, but thick and real to the unliving. More than all of the space in the world is being used. So you can only imagine the state of the oceans, or the cities for God's sakes. It's population 12,000 here, and you cannot move for the old dead, the sick dead, and the ancient dead. Dandies and peasants, folk from an era you hardly recognize as having happened, and they've all just been here, choking, because the dead must breathe dead air, squirming like codependent ants, make-shifting animate construction, because otherwise this eternal tide of transparent bodies might stop rocking against you altogether. And then what? No momentary bliss, for when the shift in the impossible ocean benefits you. God, you've only been in it for a few short moments, and already you tire of the new now. It cannot be stopped, and it cannot be avoided because you cannot squirm through the density. This is forever, and it will only grow larger and thicker and tighter, and then what? There are too many ghosts. So when you wake under surgical lamps, the Russian masked men seem satisfied with your sudden rebirth. There's a cheer as you come back to life through artificial means and sincere effort. Once again do you breathe the air of the living, and like few do, now you know the truth of the matter. Knowing and knowing that you cannot escape it are two very different things. You felt what happened, you breathed in reverse. Your blood ran still, the whip crack of your heart reacting to the adrenaline, and the noxious hungover radiation that oxygen deprivation leaves in your brain prove that. You almost wish you hadn't come back, because waiting will be the worst part. You have been listening to the Bone Zone Halloween half... Oh, fuck me, it's not over yet. Here, in my crooked cauldron, I have written you a wicked cassoulet. With my bare hands, I have wrangled approximately 11,600 characters from the alphabet safari to produce our final metaphorical visit to the otolaryngologist, a tale simply entitled, Can I Borrow You for a Minute? I thought he was one of those missionary fellas at first. I'd never seen missionaries in Sydney before. Just the Jehovah's, sort of on street corners and the like. They've got those pamphlet stands and those fearsome smiles, that uninviting Granny Wolf sort of deal. Truth is, I was too quick to assume that this top-stretched, wiry-looking fella had the good word of God in his assistant editor-red, ballpoint pen-stained shirt pocket. At first, I just watched from a distance because he was alone, shaking like a shitting dog, and I couldn't help my eyes from wandering. He was standing in the Jehovah fella's usual spot, with his feet out past his shoulders, a stance he constantly fought against. I missed my first L90 out of Brookvale before he clocked me trying to figure out his deal. He wore the classic starched button-up, but if his appearance mattered to him, he'd bleach out that big red stain, or apply some pawpaw to his cracked lips.
Occasionally, he'd burst out laughing, just to himself. He wore his hair military cut, so I could see he didn't have an ear to the goon show or something. I guess Tourette's, but I knew not to ask. He approached like he wanted me to sign something, but upon closer inspection, he took his red clipboard back before I could even look at it. He slumped himself down on the bus waiter bench and tucked it beneath his thigh. His icebreaker was something like, "Don't you think Sydney's the loneliest city in the world?" Like he knew I wasn't from around here, like he could smell my working holiday visa just as well as he could my SPF 100 sunscreen. Then, he laughed. Like I'd answered with a rendition of Spike Milligan's Dead Hunter joke. You know, it was voted the world's funniest joke by some fella at the University of Hertfordshire. That's where I'm studying. Next year, obviously. This year, I'm in Sydney, working as a cook, chatting crap to this fella. He had a persistent stutter, too. Frankly, the man was falling apart at the seams. Shook my hand like he was jerking it off. Held on a little too long. Introduced himself as Arnold. Probably didn't like being called Arnie, but I did it anyway. I said, "Arnie, if you don't mind me asking, I gotta say, are you one of those missionary fellas? Nothing against you if you are. Like, I'm just not sure I have much to say on the topic." He smiled this time, but didn't laugh. Hardly made a sound for 2 minutes, like he was lining up his words all perfect like. He still flubbed the first few, and it reminded me of how my brother went to speech therapy when he was younger. Sort of made me want to stay. I felt like nobody else would do it. Not that I'm the nicest bloke in the world or anything. I just felt bad for the guy. He said, "I actually represent a social club. Did you know that 1 in 4 Australians feel like they don't have a lot in common with anybody around them?" I think Arnie had a hard time maintaining eye contact, and that's something I can relate to pretty hard. There was a bit of a mutual understanding between us, though I didn't appreciate the sentiment of his sudden spiel about being Billy No-Mates. As he methodically maneuvered past each syllable, I joined him in looking out across the road at this old boy in an oversized plastic Macintosh. I was a little worried for him because he didn't have any shopping bags with him. The bus stop in Brookvale is outside Warringah Mall. There's really no other reason to go there, unless you're looking to buy shoes or something. He looked a little frail to be going into Sydney at 6 p.m. because he was half propping himself up on a set of forearm crutches with a loose, stooped posture, feet out past his shoulders, shaking like a shitting dog. I think Arnie was still mid-pitch trying to sell his social club to me, but I'd basically stopped listening. I felt a little bad, if I'm being honest. He'd called it the Brookvale Humane Society, and I'd sure like to know why, but I'd missed my opportunity. I'd be getting on the bus in about 5 minutes, and I knew I'd need to sign something before this transaction was over. At least, that's what I thought at the time, because he had that ink on his shirt and the clipboard. But by the end of it, I didn't sign anything. I don't even think he had a pen on him, come to think of it. I was busy, wondering if he was suffering from something degenerative, or if he was born like this. It's rude, I know. Morbid curiosity, I guess. Impulsive, intrusive thoughts. Questions that you cannot ask aloud because why do you deserve to know the answer? It's none of your business, pal. I've got a lot to work on socially, but even I know that. Arnie sure was deep into the spiel. He'd even stopped stuttering for the most part. It had a rhythm to it, sort of like it was designed just for him. "We were all about conservation of comestibles," he was saying at the time. "You understand, don't you?" He had another outburst after that, just a short one, almost stifled, but it was quite clear that he just couldn't help it. It hurt when he did it, you know? He just looked so helpless. You could tell he really struggled with it, so I guess it must have been degenerative. It took a second for the salesman's glimmer to return to his eyes. Then, he'd go back to the old boy. Like how, when you're feeling seasick, the best thing to do is focus on the horizon. I'd like to think that. Really. Because the other option, I think, is that he couldn't look away from what he might become one day soon, by the look of it. And loneliness, so I've been told, is almost just as bad as punching 20 darts a day. I answered out of pure shock. Is it? Is that what they say? I responded because I'd just taken up smoking for the additional comfort breaks I earned for spending nearly $40 a pack. I recently learned that cocaine was cheaper than cigarettes because the head chef took it for productivity reasons. That's what he said. I think it might have just been because he was a knobhead. To make a long story short, I've not made many friends since coming here because I do not like the job, and I don't much like the people doing the job alongside me. My point is that I realized that I'd been doing double damage to myself, and I resolved to change that as soon as I could. I didn't tell him, of course. In fact, when he asked me if I was a smoker, I told him a barefaced lie. "Would you say," he said, that you lived a fairly wholesome life. I asked him for a little context, like as in Bible quoting, love thy neighbor, never even thought about doing a drug or two, or like as in nearly eating a meal a day, occasionally taking care of yourself, and sometimes thinking about church. He smiled again. It did wonders for my confidence, let me tell you. I think of myself as a funny guy, I really do. I just don't know how to use that, you know? He told me that he more meant the latter, but both were totally valid. I liked that, you know? That's a good strategy, I think. He was playing both sides, but I knew his game. Probably got some kind of finder's fee for bringing a mate along to the meetings. I think he called them dinner parties. I liked that too, made it fun. He asked me something else, after a few minutes of careful word plotting. He asked me, would you say that you've lived a fulfilling life? For a moment. I actually thought about it. Then I got sort of angry about it because it felt like a step too far, like he was taking some of my oxygen, like he was selling my personal data. I never thought I'd have to read the terms and conditions of a conversation, offended by this suggestion of small talk small print. I think I said, could you read that back for me? Arnie took his time explaining himself, but he did it quite well, all things considered. He stood up as he spoke, which made me feel like a real piece of shit. I was quick to anger, really. I always have been, I guess. I felt especially bad, because he told me that he meant no offense, and I think he really meant it. He made eye contact for one thing. I mean, I clocked him in my periphery, saw him turning his head, and he sort of just drew me in, like when you're not expecting your own reflection, but it's there, and it's looking at you. He said, I think you're in the right, questioning me. It's only natural to question everything, don't you think? He didn't really wait for an answer. I figured I'd like you. You're open-minded. I spilled the beans and you didn't even judge. The good ones, he said, never come to me. I always have to go to them. If I'm being honest with you, I don't often get this far into the script. About then, the L90 showed up. I felt self-conscious, like I knew that I had to get on the bus, but Arnie was about to tell me something that might change my entire goddamn life. I crossed my fingers and, to my delight, the driver cut the engine. Often, at this stop, two drivers will switch over. It takes them about 15 minutes to do it. I guess it's a shift thing. I figured Arnie had a quota to fill. His shaking was, if anything, progressively getting worse. Nerves, maybe. He'd hardly gotten to practice this particular part of his spiel. He started laughing again, and instinctively I moved myself back a little. I apologized, obviously. I let him keep going like any good bloke would. He pointed back to where he'd been sat, over at the clipboard. I scanned over a list of 12 names, their height, weight, and smoking status. Each one had an upcoming date beside its name. Besides those marked M, must have been married, I thought. Like a singles club. Might be fun, I thought. According to the dates, they met every Wednesday. Arnie informed me that it would be around 6 p.m. He told me to call him to make the arrangements, but to do it the night before, all secret-like. I did something like this in college. Called it the 10-minute club. Sent you a text 10 minutes before a pre-planned event, and if you wanted to go, you'd just go. I never really wanted to go. I mostly just stayed home. They looked fully booked, which was a good sign. Each name was written in a different handwriting, with a different ink and a different signature. I didn't have a pen, but I didn't need one. Arnie gave me his business card instead, and I got his name, his number, and the motto, ego non famem, to take home with me. It did have stray smears of the ink on it. I bet they all did, poor bastard. All I could do was thank him and leave for the bus. I took a seat on the right-hand side and looked out for the old boy. I think he'd gotten too hot because he'd finally taken off his Macintosh. Beneath it, he was a big fella. His polyester button-up was dripping with sweat, and it had its own fair share of stains. I could only assume that he was also part of Arnie's group, though I can't imagine him having much luck at it. He had the same clipboard, see? He handed it to this porky chap, who was standing just behind him now. They weren't saying much to each other. In fact, the old boy looked annoyed at him, sort of like he wanted to yell something obscene at this poor kid, but he didn't, on account of his job and all. Porkchop looked to be about my age, maybe a little younger. The bus pulled away from the scene before I could see if he got a business card too, though I guess I'll just find out in a couple of days. As we turned off, caught the old boy, snatching his clipboard back. Looked like a nasty fella, really. Compared to me, Porkchop got a bit of a raw deal. From the biros in my bloodstream, translated by magic and chemical interference, and slam-dunked into the tracing paper of your soul. This has been the Bone Zone Halloween Half Hour, and I have been your host, Jake Lucy, a man destined to fight Andre the Giant at WrestleMania 3, but denied the opportunity when fate birthed me several decades too late. This audio scene was produced for the Sleepy Bones Detective Agency and is copyright 2020. Any and all resemblance to actual persons living or dead is purely coincidental, even the ones I outright named. If you liked this, you might like just giving me some money, which you can do at patreon.com/SBDA. You can also find us on Spotify and YouTube as the Skull Surreal Podcast Hub, or at my day job, where I am always just one day away from retirement. Until next time, remember to leave breadcrumbs behind you when you leave, drink lots of water, and work really hard and forever until you die. Gabba gabba hey. Hey.